My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankaran, Guru Piran New, fellow Jnanis. I'm so happy that I'm able to, beam across from Washington, D.C. today. Um, Beautiful country, a lot of, I've had a chance to visit some of the historical sites and the beginning of the country and the formation of the republic. Very interesting, evolution of human beings, particularly, I think, for one of the greatest nations and a major leader globally for democratic reforms and also scientific. So quite an interesting, for me, this is also a learning part of learning about different cultures, different way of life, and so on. And I think as part of the spiritual journey, we should try to understand, learn, reflect, introspect, contemplate, and meditate upon the wide variety of lifestyles, culture, and so on. And I think that's part of the spiritual journey that all of us should embark. First, discovering the universe within us and the universe outside us. So I'm really fortunate that I'm able to still come through the meditation to Malaysia, but in a different part of the world. Okay, in the last satsang, last two satsangs. Last week I was not there; I was traveling. Um, we discussed about a very important concept of respect, and the respect comes from having a great reverence and respect for one's own divinity. And when one realizes one's own potential divine force that is core to our DNA, then you see that the mind, which for most people are very material and very limited and very transitory, becomes more and more inspired by that universal identity, by that state of peace and calm and tranquility. And in that state, while in that meditation state, so we have three important states, actually four important states. The first one is essentially our deep sleep state. We are in that divine state. Then we also have the state of deep meditation. Again, if one does it really well, one would also realize that deep, divine state. In the next state is actually our dream state. Our dream state is the state where we, for some people, the dream is they feel as though it's like real. For others, there's a lot of fleeting thoughts that come. Again, one can explain why the dream state is there. Sometimes there's remnants of thoughts that are there before you go to sleep, and the brain has this tendency and the power to interpret every information that is there in the brain. And sometimes the information is partial, or sometimes there's multiple partial information. The mind tries to piece it together into some sort of coherence that gives us, some kind of visual experience. And oftentimes we forget it when we wake up. Sometimes when it's deep, we can remember it. But nevertheless, they are also fleeting and transitory. And the last one is essentially our thoughts and experiences while we are awake. And this is where sometimes if you are decoupled, so in the dream state, we are in the original state, still in the divine state, but the mind is interpreting all the, fragments of information from that material world, which is transitory, fleeting. In the awakened state, oftentimes we have all kinds of interactions and experiences. Again, we form thoughts and ideas and so on, and that impacts our emotional states. And we see that sometimes what happens is that in the dream state, it has an impact, but we also see that sometimes we have people have nightmares, they have all those experiences has an impact, but it disappears. And sometimes the nightmares could be quite severe that it wakes people up, or has deep emotional impact. The same thing we see that in the waking state, we have all kinds of interactions, both sukha and dukkha's, and again, it impacts our personality, our emotional state, and so on. But in all those four states, we have a permanent substratum called that, big I, or, the divine state that all of us are powered. Now, these great saints and sages realize that whatever these four different states are, but they're all powered by this one, uh, you know, state of existence, which is, sometimes we call it self, sometimes we call it Atma, we call it many, many, many names. But the interesting thing is that through so the conditions where we understand the self is the conditions where the mind is slowly suspended into this state, but it's decoupled from that material state of existence, which is matter and energy, causal. So we experience this in the deep sleep state, but nobody really analyzes it. But if we analyze it very, very carefully, we see that that's the state of nothing state, right? And it's a very beautiful, pristine state where even the great uh, saint, or sages, prince, pauper, all are in that same state of existence, in that quantum soup of infinite potential. But in the waking state, they are very different. The same thing happens in a deep meditation state when one is able to slowly, decouple from that material existence where there's intensive focus from that material thoughts to that optional thought, and ultimately even the optional thought disappears, and one sits on that boundary between materiality and spirituality. And the great saints and sages know how to cross between those boundaries and realize that when one pushes the mind to a much more deeper state, that material existence or identity dissipates. Hence, the hypothesis that everything starts from that spiritual identity is tested out. And they test out by validating and transforming their mind into a laboratory to go through this transition of intensive materiality right up to the state of the optional thought that all they have is that vibration, the humanly bodily vibration. When the spirit comes in contact with the body, it reverberates. The material universe is one that has got vibration. The base uh, conscious state of this material body is a base vibration. We call it many, many names. We call it Bhagavan's Geetam, God's vibration. We call it Unarvu. We call it different names. Whatever that name could be. Om, you know, even that state, when one goes deeper, that spiritual, so there's a realm between the pure spiritual identity, which is transcendental to that material identity. Then you've got the full material identity, and you've got the state that is between the two. And that's what most meditators experience. Oh, nice feeling, everything is quiet. I get this vibration, the divine vibration. The brain is relaxed, the body is relaxed. When I come out of it, wow, it feels so blissful. And most people think that's what bliss is. But Mahan and other great saints have pushed even further. That's still a temporary state. The spiritual identity, the spiritual personality that is in touch or in connection with the material identity resonates in vibration. Besides all the other thoughts, this is before all the other thoughts are generated. That gives you a kind of a blissful experience. But that's not what enlightenment is. And enlightenment is that pure state of consciousness, which is absent of the material identity nor the vibrations. You can see that in many scriptures, they speak about this boundary and transcending to that final reality, which is so. When one understands this state, one has, wow, this state is the permanent state, this immovable state, this immovable state moves everything, right? This, permanent states moves all other states of existence. So we see that that's what the respect and reverence is in all the scriptures, by all the great saints and prophets, and every spiritual book gives respect and reverence to this spiritual substratum that is timeless, you know, that is, transcendental, and that is universal. This state, when the mind, you know, rests on the state, the mind realizes the power of the state, and it has that full respect and reverence for the state, right? So when the mind is inoculated with this, and when the mind, comes back to that, the boundary state and that material state, the mind, when it remembers the state, the mind has so much respect and reverence, and everything, including the boundary state and the material state, will reverberate with this respect and reverence of this universal identity, that outlook, and so on. Though there are a lot of things changing in that material reality, it says all this is happening only because of this divine state. All the things that are moving, all the parts are moving in life is because of this immovable state. And you have full respect and reverence. And when you do that, you see that you have tremendous respect for this material universe. You don't dismiss it. You do not dismiss life, like many other people say, well, life is, Maya or illusion. Yes, it's a changing substratum, but you have full respect that what is making this change is that changeless substratum in everything. So you have a greater respect and reverence for that meditation state and for that waking state. And when we have full respect and reverence for that waking state, we see that we have full respect and reverence for our lives. Even though our life is, our material life, shelf life is finite, that is powered by an infinite. So the mind's focus is not on the finiteness, but the infiniteness. That comes with tremendous amount of respect and reverence. The same thing, the mind, though it is supported by a brain that is matter and energy, which is mortal, the mind realizes, though physically I am mortal, but the mind itself is immortal. The same thing, the body is perishable, but what gives that body that identity and the imperishability is what gives it that value. So we see this respect and reverence for ourselves, both in that spiritual realm, in that intermediate, that meditative, that sadhu realm that all of us experience, and that, active life where everything is being powered by this. So we have respect for our lives. When we have respect and reverence for our lives, we have respect and reverence for everything around us, right? Nature, right? And we become one with nature. And I think yesterday or day before yesterday, I posted on what that oneness means. That oneness only can take place if one has that respect and reverence for the divinity that is in all of us, the big I, So that memory of that experience in that meditative state and the deep sleep state percolates into our intermediate state and into our waking state. So when we have the respect, you see that our whole behavior changes. When we were restless and feisty and all kinds of challenges, we see that it becomes more calmer and cooler, and we're able to think very carefully. Our clarity of thought becomes, awesome. That we then are able to, make right decisions, not be impacted by things. We have respect for our partners. We have respect for our family and reverence for our family. Ultimately, physically, we may be different, but spiritually, we are bounded and we are wedded and welded, spiritually. So we have the respect for the person in that spiritual identity. After all, they are one. As Swami says, ni na nane ni niyum nanum nane na. At that realm, we are all one. So the respect is not at the material and superficial level, it's much more deeper. The same thing with friends, colleagues, the general public, including animals and the things around us, the plants. And so we see that respect and reverence becomes embedded in everything that we do. And once you start, when the mind kind of envelops in that respect and reverence for that universal identity, the mind starts glowing. You could see that in your own personality. The people around that will be able to see that glowing personality. Your family's lifestyle becomes more glowing, become more harmonious. The same thing with your workplace and in all the realms that you are touching with that inspired mind. So this is what Swamiji speaks about. And I'm going to run through a few of Swamiji's quotes and other people's quotes that actually capture this. Then I'll come back to how do we do it during our day-to-day activity? How do we cognize that self? I spoke about this in the previous satsang, and also in the WhatsApp on what that self means, the characteristics of the self. Everybody speaks about the self, the Atma, various things. And here is the description that I have experienced, and Mahan speaks about it. The self is, when people ask to describe what that is, many people find it very difficult to describe this thing that is spiritual, neither matter and energy. It's difficult to describe because we're so used to describing object things. This is a laptop, this is a cup of coffee, this is, we can describe that. But how do you describe that which is describing everything, right? So we have to then self-reflect. So we can see an object, this is what the laptop looks like, this is how Mahan's book look like, this is all objects. So we can observe, we can understand, we can rationalize. But now part of this self-realization process is to reflect back on the reflector that is reflecting on everything. And that requires a tremendous amount of mental mind, intellectual curiosity and sharpness to be able to self-reflect and say, hey, I'm describing the entire world, let me understand who the describer is. And that requires to describe something, an object, one really needs to do a lot of research to fully understand what this object is, whether it's a plant or whether it is soil, or it requires, if you really want to know something. So you've got to, sometimes people go to university, they get a degree, they do their doctorate, and then further research on something to understand a particular thing, right? But can you imagine now turning that back and trying to reflect back on that which describes everything for you in this universe? That requires tremendous amount of effort, tremendous amount of, really intensity to understand that. Those who put in that effort will be able to, discover this. Similar to any other professions. You want to be a good medical doctor, you spend, 13 years of high school, 5 years of medical training, another 5 years of training, subspecialization. By the time you finish everything, you become a specialist in a heart or a particular area. That's just the human body. But similarly for a mechanic, right? If you really want to know everything about automobile, you study right up to university and then go on to doing research just to be a specialist in combustion or particular type of automobile engineer. The same thing, we need to put in a lot of effort to discover the discoverer, and you have to put in a lot of knowledge to know the knower. And that's what it is, not a 5-year course or 10-year course. It's a lifelong journey that one slowly unravels this. So coming back to this description, as I said, the description is that how do we describe the self? It's silent and it's simple, nothing complicated, right? Sometimes our material personality is really complicated. It's silent and simple, right? And when it's silent, it means it's absence of all this material identity and persona and the personalities that we put in. In that state, everybody is equal. The pauper and the prince, the Mahan and a novice. So we see that that state is exists for everybody. The second one I spoke about is the E within the self is actually the eternality, timeless. Time doesn't touch it, right? And we see this, in our deep sleep state, in our deep meditation state, in our dream state, it has impact in the material, but in that first two state, it is timeless and it's not impacted. And we also see that in that state, we have that liberation, the state of transcendentality. Nothing impacts you, nothing blemishes you. And finally, we see that everything starts, you know, and ends with us, right? So if you see, I'll come back to how we see this in the material reality. So this finality is there. Everything starts with us and ends with us. We have everything to make ourselves happy and inspired. We have everything in ourselves to make ourselves miserable and and terrible. So this is the human mind. It was quite interesting that I had a chance to visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington D.C. And the amazing thing is that we see how the human mind can cause so much misery in people's lives that we don't need to create a hell. The hell was already on earth. And going through each of those description clearly shows that the human mind can create a hell that is far more furious than the hell that we have ever imagined. You know, even if there was a Lucifer, he will say, "My God, you guys have done a better, much more better job than us." So the human mind can really be, you know, divine and pristine, but also it can create the worst heaven on earth for ourselves and for everybody else. So this is where that part of the spirituality is that part of that journey is actually to really understand the human mind, the power of the human mind for both good things and also negative things. And how do we continuously harness this respect for this divine things within us to create the life that we want. So here, just to give you that overview, and I'll come back to how do we observe that self. But let me just go through. Swamiji here speaks about this notion of this respect and reverence. He says that the human mind is so powerful that if you have tremendous reverence for it, it is able to remove all the defects, all the blemishes, and all the challenges. And he says very clearly, the cry for the removal of defect is God. That's what divinity is. When we are able to slowly remove the defects from ourselves, that noise from ourselves, that material, fascinations and material, fetishes, slowly as we start removing, we start seeing that true divinity started to emerge. He says his defects here, he's speaking about the limitedness. And he says that when one is able to remove that, one realizes that divinity in us, that universal identity. He's describing the self here. And he says that the action of the person who has removed the defect is God. There's two meanings here. One is that there's a thirst. We all know that, we all want to be able to discover this universal divine identity. And that cry, that earnestness, the intensiveness. And when one does that, one realizes the truth. That's one end, the self. Now, when we reflect back to this material world, similarly, we see that when we are inspired and we see other people in very challenging circumstances going through various challenges, and if we are able to inspire them and remove all those, challenges, show them the way to do it, Swamiji then says that these people are divine incarnate. He says that, one is that when we remove our own, defects, we discover that divinity in us. And it doesn't stop there. It also percolates and permeates to others and inspires others, like a fire. When you discover the fire in yourself, you're able to light the fire to others. And that's what he's describing here, the respect and reverence for this divinity. In every temple or places of worship you go, as you walk in, ultimately you'll see an urn of fire, right, that symbolizes that human spirit, that symbolizes, that gives us that light, symbolizes that it burns everything to cinder, right, and ashes. So that divine fire he's speaking about, that if we're able to remove all of that, we discover that fire within us, that illuminator that ultimately helps illumine others. So this is what he's speaking about. That only comes when we have respect and reverence for many things. Our material things, our bank accounts, our houses, our titles, and all those things. All these are temporary and fleeting. The moment death happens, all that disappears. But that which stays with us permanently, that is timeless, and you know the material world doesn't touch, is that divine substratum that I'm speaking about itself. So here Swamiji describes this state. Here Swamiji goes on to say much more deeper thing. He says when one stays in his true state, that God realized state, he says that his bliss becomes great. It's like you understand that greatness of this divinity that powers everything in this universe. The flower of good is blossom. You see that good universal thoughts. He says this fragrance, the fragrance blossom. You can see that when somebody who's enlightened is there, the whole room just transforms. The words inspires, and all temperamental effects are removed. That means everything that is temporary and transitory just is moved, because now you move to the permanent state. He says evil mind is completely transformed. Whatever negativity we think is completely, disappears, as how the dew on the leaves, dissipates when the sun comes out. Talks about that clarity of thought, clarity in thought and quantum of knowledge increases. So our understanding our own reality becomes far greater, and how it interfaces with this material reality. And he says sobriety and full consciousness permanently stays. When one attains that, when you attain this state, it never leaves you. And this is why everybody should endeavor to touch this state. And this is where the intensity, and it continuously grows. And here Swami speaks about this state. I want to come back to other great scholars that have also spoken about this state, right? And he's, here Rumi speaks about silence. This is the first door of self, is the language of God. So everything else is a poor translation. So everything you do, whether, saying things and all that, is not as important as getting into this silent state. The mode of getting into the silent state is meditation. No other acharas or rituals will take you there except for this pursuit of that self-reflection, of that knower and the discoverer. Here again, more description given by great saints like Mahan. He says, I have been a seeker and I'm still am, but I stopped asking the books and the stars. I started listening to the teachings of my soul. So that now the reflection is not from what the information given by others, but you're listening to the inner voice, that Bhagavan's Geetam in all of us. And that comes with so much reference and reverence and respect. Sometimes people say, oh, Guru, I don't have time for meditation. I don't have this and that. I always reflect and say, look, you cannot afford not to do it, right? If you have full respect for that self, that is what you start off with, and that is what you permeate your entire life with. And you see that everything else will take shape. I want to give you an example of this. There is a nice story in Katha Upanishad where Nachiketa is made to wait by Lord Yama. And Lord Yama said, it is a sin to keep a Brahman. The Brahmana means the epitome of Brahman. To keep that Brahman, that universal identity, although he was a 6-year-old boy that came to seek some questions, seek some answers to some questions, by keeping him waiting for 3 days is a sin, right? And here, the point is that even how great you are, even the Lord Himself, when we keep our divinity, our big I, the divine force in us, when we decouple it even for a temporary second, right? We get into that state of sin. Sin means ignorance here, right? So we cannot afford not to be in this state, right? So how do we then allocate time for ourselves for meditation, introspection, contemplation, reflection, and then percolate, discover that self, and percolate that into every facet of our lives so that we are not decoupled from it. We are always in that oneness state, right? As long as we are not in that oneness state, we will be in that state of ignorance, what great saints call sin. So here, we have to start listening to our own soul and self. And this is what Mahan's teachings and the great saints' teachings are. Very simple, nothing complicated, right? Nothing, you don't need to do anything. You just need to do nothing, which is essentially the state of meditation. And again, I'm really inspired by Rumi because he reminds me of many things that Mahan's teachings are. And they come from a very similar place, in part of India. And suppose, they have a lot of time to reflect. Here again, he says very beautifully, I searched for God and found only myself. I searched for myself and I found only God. Beautiful saying. I mean, you can clearly see that the words that come out is this awesome beauty that the mind is completely enraptured by the soul force of the God force. Otherwise, you would not get beautiful poetries that really resonates. And when we read it and reflect, and it really touches the core to who we are. So this is what the respect is not about material respect or putting on white clothes or putting on a saffron clothes. And as I said very clearly, that it is not what the clothes that we put in, or white clothes that to define purity. Our mind must be white and pure. It is not about putting the saffron garb as a way of identifying our spirituality. If the saffron has important qualities, it's a quality that essentially purifies and cleanses, and also purifies the human mind. It has got many antibacterial properties that really get rid of many things, bacteria, and in that same way the saffron should inoculate our mind against all these challenges, the thoughts that makes our mind small or shrunken or limited. So it is not what we use physically, it's the state of our mind, our heart, and our intellect that is more important, that defines who we are. So Dosham.